Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privileged access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW.
Welcome back, everyone, for the news of June 10th, 2018, or week of June 10th, 2018. I should have corrected myself there. A couple of quick announcements. First, check out our on-demand material. Some of our previously recorded webcasts are now available on demand at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Who would have thought? Ticket sales are also open for Social Engineering Rhode Island Conference, which is coming this Saturday, June 16th at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. Go to se-ri.org to register. The folks that are organizing that, Lee Snyder and Patrick, are incredible, quite frankly. So you definitely should go and enjoy that. They have a huge lineup of some of the top names in social engineering in the industry going to that. Of course, how do you feel about user and entity behavior analytics? Well, if people are social engineering, you probably would care about that a lot. But also, computationally speaking, you're probably going to want to know about that inside of your SIM. So check out Logarithm's webcast on June 14th at 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's June 14th, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern for Logarithm's SIM webcast. You think you probably should check that out, especially if you need some behavior analytics. With that, let's talk about the news for this week, Paul. Which one did you want to jump to first? I know that you mentioned FireFox there a moment ago. Happy to chat about that.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting, and I didn't get into the details of the actual exploit, but they did show a proof of concept that you can execute cross-site scripting via CSS, which I thought was interesting, and I remember seeing those attacks when they were coming about. But what's more interesting to me was, as I mentioned earlier, that this was a bug that was fixed and then reintroduced, which tells me they didn't hear our interview with Pete or listen to a lot of the advice out there about how to do regression testing and agile, and make sure you're writing those tests and that they're baked into the development process.
What was interesting about this bug specifically is it looks like the way that they actually implemented this was they effectively just encoded everything about the URL JavaScript alert location inside of the CSS, just called some style tags accordingly, and then as that was being interpreted by the browser, would spin up an actual alert box. Mm-hmm. So this was really interesting regression. It does look like it has been patched at this point. In fact, I tried going to the bug report that was in the references itself, and it looks like I was locked out. I don't know if it's just because I don't have like a Mozilla bug tracking account or what have you. But
well, and hopefully it's pretty easy to fix a bug you've already fixed.
Yeah, you think, right?
Right.
I mean, this hasn't been seen since 2006. It's a 12-year-old bug. I mean, people could have moved on since then that actually knew how to fix this thing. I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting that it suddenly came back, speaking of regression tests. So,
I think there's a really interesting piece of research in security that is, if you were to take a given project, software project, and go back through its bug vulnerability history, security-related bugs, and go back and retest those against different versions, like which ones would show up.
You actually see that not regularly, but on occasion, right? So I know that a few weeks ago we talked about, or maybe it was a few months ago at this point, the Electron bugs. We've talked about a number of bugs that had just different version problems, like the Git bug last week, right? So remote code execution. That was covering a bunch of different versions of Git. as well, and it was like 2.12 dot whatever and 2.14 dot whatever, and so it's interesting that it's almost like certain versions of the code aren't vulnerable, maybe just because that code isn't reached as part of the testing suite or as part of the use case, and so. Yeah, it would be well. So let me maybe opine on that just a little bit. As a bug bounty hunter in my free time, that is one of the things that I love to do is go back and look at sites for places where I've actually found and reported bugs that supposedly have been fixed, and then find other bugs, right? So or they've introduced new features, and I find the same bug. So that is something that I think a lot of security researchers do. I don't know that a lot of developers are writing the kind of tests that they need to actually, address these problems appropriately. But that is one of the things that, especially with talking with Pete just now, I highly recommend people do is test-driven development to the best of your ability. Because if you have even malicious user tests as part of that test suite, well, guess what? You're going to get a whole lot better at, preventing regression, first of all. And then you can actually track that prevention based on all of the metrics from your tooling. So at the end of the day, if you can get unified dashboards that will give you that data, you're going to be much better off. In fact, I am...
I was just going to say what I thought was an interesting tie-in was the Windows 10 April 2018 will break SMBv1. And that's like if you've got a certain piece of code that's the source of a lot of your vulnerabilities and bugs, you can just deprecate it altogether and not have to worry about it ever again.
Right. So what's interesting here is where they actually broke this on purpose, right? And the quotes that I pulled out of this article that I thought were just so great was it seems that there are a lot of people who need to use it, and some people have had success in disabling Windows Defender so that SMBv1 will still work. I mean, talk about literally hanging on to the ledge by your fingertips when it comes to using SMBv1. So for those that aren't fully aware, the SMBv1 protocol is largely what led to the WannaCry outbreak of malware last year. So I know a lot of companies reacted to this quite quickly when they found that, hey, guess what? Our own code is using SMBv1, and suddenly all of the world's firewalls are blocking it, so therefore our customers can't use our product. That was one of those things that you saw being fixed left, right, and center, but it seems as though, for some reason, probably with internal applications, there are companies that are still relying on SMBv1, just like they're still relying on Flash, for example, on those internal applications. I don't know, Paul. I'm of the mind that Windows is doing the world right by killing SMBv1. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you could also look at it that Microsoft wants everyone to upgrade and be on a Microsoft platform as well. As I believe if you disable SMBv1 and you've got OS 10 in the mix, it could be problematic.
That's probably true. It's all three of them really. Apple, especially last week with their WWDC and some of the things that they talked about with killing, tracking of people based on their like buttons on pages. It seems that they're all throwing daggers at one another in their own certain ways, and this might be just one of those, which is, guess what? You got Macs on your network, you can't share things anymore. But then again, I mean,
also to Microsoft's credit as well. I forget the individual's name that works for Microsoft that wrote a blog post before WannaCry came out, and he's the lead for like the SMB functionality within Windows, and he basically said, yeah, everyone should disable V1. Like, don't use V1. It's just we've just discovered it is just not secure at all, and you should disable it. And that was published before WannaCry.
Right, and yet here we are, people still apparently crying about the fact that they can't use SMBv1.
Right.
I don't know.
I don't want to be Microsoft to make those, product management decisions because they have far-reaching consequences, both positive and negative.
Yeah. Well, in this case, I think that this is technical debt coming to roost, as it were. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's time to pay, and in this case, that means just update your code. Come on. So yeah, if you're a listener and your organization is still using SMBv1, we won't necessarily, in this case, I can say that we won't uncloak you for it, but I'd be interested to know if there are any of the people that are listening to the show that have tools using SMBv1 and are affected by this. Feel free to reach out, hoodie@securityweekly.com. Love to know how this is still being used in your environment, because honestly, I can't think of a reason why you'd want to, unless, of course, you have a mixed environment using something like Mac OS. But Paul, wouldn't they just be using like Dropbox or Google Drive or something at this point?
Yeah, that's true. Sure. I mean, you could get there's lots of ways to share files for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, just, Python, simple HTTP, and you're done.
Yeah.
Moving on, though, speaking of things being broken, so Signal apparently had some issues with its disappearing messages. Did you read up on this at all, Paul?
I didn't. I know they introduced this feature. It's a newer feature that Signal introduced to make messages disappear, which I always thought was kind of shady. More for like cheating spouses. It's like a cheating spouse feature. I'm like really? It's just anyway. But now some of them don't really disappear, which is kind of interesting.
So I think that I don't think it was the cheating spouse problem. At least I like to think so in my world of rainbows and unicorns and cupcakes. I think that it was actually designed for journalists, believe it or not. So you've got a source that gave you information. You want it to delete after a certain period of time because heaven forbid you're a journalist. You enter a foreign country and they take your phone, right?
Well, and don't get me wrong, privacy is good, right? And we've covered this on the show for the past 14 or so years. Privacy is good, but anytime we increase privacy, there's also people who abuse that privacy to do unethical things.
Right. That's absolutely true. And so what was interesting about this is they did update this and fix the issue. But what was happening was when it was functioning normally, disappearing messages deleted the chats sent after the user had switched it on, but did not go back and retroactively delete any of the chats where this was now turned on. So basically it was an everything from this point forward fix. And people were saying, we thought this was going to do this for all chat messages. So in some ways, it makes me wonder if it was ever really broken, if it was, quote unquote, working as intended.
Yeah, I would say that would be working as intended. I mean, the Signal team is hyper-focused on security and privacy. So, the number of actual vulnerabilities that Signal has had is extremely low. Like, maybe one that I can remember covering. The other ones that were kind of purported as, oh, this could be bad, and this is a vulnerability, and that's not really a vulnerability in Signal. That could be, you're running an Android, and you're going to be vulnerable regardless of whatever app you're running an Android because it's Android kind of thing.
Yeah, well, there was a story that didn't make it into this week's show notes because I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate for this show, but maybe it was. Related to Android, and I think it was port 5555 or 55555. Mm-hmm. That's your debug port that requires no authentication, is being found to be used for botnets. Mm-hmm. Basically, your phone is accessible to the internet on a network somewhere, and it just gets consumed. So maybe we'll talk about it next week if it doesn't get covered on Paul's Security Weekly, the main show.
But that's a great point related to this show, Keith, because we talked about in the previous segment, software testing, right? And testing your software. And what I find, having managed our own software project here at Security Weekly, right, is there's this temptation to be like, well, I really want to automate testing. But how do I automate testing and give it the level of access it requires to do that testing? And I think a lot of roads that people go down are like, oh, we'll just have a debug port. And we don't want to require authentication because then we got to write a whole bunch of code in order to test that functionality. And so that's, I think, how a lot of these debugging backdoors are built in, is with good intentions, sometimes comes bad results.
Well, hard-coded passwords on Cisco devices, mire the news stories of the last 14 years.
Yeah. But I've seen a lot of functionality require, you can see that we built this functionality in to allow this to work, and therefore we had to sidestep some authentication. I've seen that actually in embedded systems. There was the Joel's backdoor bug, right? It was like, oh, well, if you set your user agent to this special string, everything's authenticated. And that was to allow the web app to talk to the back end without requiring the user to enter their password 8 million times. And so these are design decisions that have gone horribly wrong.
Right. And I think in this case, what could have been solved here with the Signal disappearing messages issue was better messaging around the fact that if you turn this on, it is a forward-looking feature, not a retroactive feature, and make sure that you define retroactive in a way that absolutely everybody could understand, because I don't know how specific that is, as an English language term.
No, I get you.
So, but yeah, to the extent that I feel like people are calling this a bug, and I don't necessarily think it was. It'd be interested to see. It will never know exactly what that code looked like, I'm sure, but I'd be interested to actually see what they did to change this and make it retroactive. Maybe it was just, so much demand came about and then bad headlines. But
I thought, Keith, the other article that I thought was really, really one of the better articles to cover this week was GitHub versus GitLab. I thought it was a great write-up.
Yes.
I don't think we've talked about on this show necessarily the kind of FUD that was thrown around when Microsoft bought GitHub, that everyone was like, I don't trust Microsoft, so I'm moving. And we're like, so like, what evidence do you have that you don't trust Microsoft? Oh, well, they hate open source. I'm like, have you been paying attention to the news? Because it really doesn't look like that to me. And I've been covering, this aspect for a long time. And I really don't see that. And I've talked to people at Microsoft, and I don't see the anti-open source in Microsoft. Now, I can get that there's some legacy trust issues there, but I see them embracing open source. And if that's your only motivation for leaving, I don't get it. But this article actually laid out the facts, which I really liked.
Yeah, it talked about features more than anything else, which I thought were important, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to think about why am I using this thing, and what does this thing do for me, right? As a side comment here, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the fact that someone did showdown against GitLab and found that, hey, guess what? GitLab is on Azure. So
that's funny.
So you're on GitHub, you're afraid of Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably not going to be running on Azure. You go to GitLab, you're still running in Azure. Like, you haven't run away from anything almost at that point. But regardless, one of the key differences that I saw was authentication levels. So with GitLab, you can set and modify people's permissions according to their role, whereas in GitHub, you can decide if someone is able to read or gets write access. So GitLab is actually a little bit more granular in that you can provide access to the issue tracker without giving permission to the source code, as an example. So one of the nice things about that is if you have people that need to be able to report a bug, they don't necessarily see the source code of your repository, but they can still report bugs to you through that issue tracker, which I thought was actually really kind of awesome. So I know
I thought the bigger one was the CICD integration. Can you talk about that a little bit, Keith? Because I read it, I'm like, that kind of sounds like a big deal, but I'm not quite sure.
So it is a big deal. This is actually something that as I was reading it, I was like, maybe I will consider switching to GitLab. And then I'm like, no, I love GitHub so much. I can't leave now. But one of the things that it does is it does have an integrated continuous integration delivery inside of GitLab, where I think with the different tiers, and I was looking at GitLab's actual pricing model, it affords you a certain amount of compute time per month for CI/CD. So in this case, it's all built in as part of the GitLab environment, whereas GitHub uses third-party integrations. So you can get a third-party integration into Travis CI, Circle CI, CodeShip for running and testing your code, but it's not included as part of your GitHub subscription. So for me, the way that I saw this, Paul, is a little bit of separation of concerns, right? I use GitHub as a source code repository. Its sole job is to, manage all of my merges, my commits, my issue tracking to some degree, maybe even hosting a wiki, right? But it's supposed to be version control, and that's really it. The thing that it offers me is the ability to then take the designed CI/CD tools such as Travis CI or Circle or CodeShip, and leverage those as part of my GitHub environment. And to that end, I think that depending on the size of your organization and depending on how forward-leaning you are in terms of writing unit and integration tests, perhaps even using test-driven development or TDD, perhaps GitLab is good if you're already in the market to start something as a greenfield project. But because I say that as knowing that Travis CI and those other continuous integration tools cost a decent amount of money per month. Like Travis is like 100, 120.
And those tools are just helping you automate your testing and integration, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. So it's effectively I'm continuously, I push code into my repository. It then tries to run my testing suite against that and integrate that code in with the other features and functionality that I'm pushing into that code repository, and perhaps even pushing into production, right? So usually you have Jenkins orchestrating.
I was going to say, okay, so we use Jenkins for that, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. So these are the tools that you would otherwise use to test for the integration of your
Mhm.
code with the rest of the code base. You still need something like Jenkins to orchestrate that process
Yep.
ultimately.
Gotcha.
And I know that Jenkins is integrated into both of these. So
Okay.
to that end, I thought that was interesting though, because for me, I'm not interested personally on my own projects to use something like Travis CI or Circle CI to run my integration suite. Admittedly, I don't build as many tests into my suite of
Right.
code that I should. Maybe that's actually something that I meant to talk with Pete a little bit about, and maybe we'll have him back to talk a little bit more about it. Is the fact that a lot of open source repositories, the bigger ones are better at this, but a lot of the smaller open source code bases don't have unit tests or
Mhm.
integration tests. Whereas I think the bigger projects definitely will have those, but it's interesting to me that you have to hit a certain, I don't know, escape velocity, I guess, as an organization, or a certain event horizon where you've grown so big that you need them to actually work within the community. So not a huge deal for a lot of people, but for those that actually care in the enterprise space, I can imagine that that will be a really big deal. The other one, Paul, that I thought was a big deal was imports and exports. I don't know if you read anything about this, but I thought that this was interesting because it doesn't necessarily keep you locked into their infrastructure.
Yeah, and so was it GitHub that allowed you to do imports and exports, and GitLab does not?
The opposite,
The
actually. In
opposite.
this
Okay.
case, it was GitHub is basically, look, you've got all of your code in your repositories. It's all sitting locally somewhere. So if you want to move it, it's pretty easy to move your code, but you can't move things like your issue tickets, your wiki,
Yeah.
like all of those other things. Whereas GitLab seems to offer the ability to export your entire project from the wiki level, the
Hmm.
project uploads, configurations, and webhook services, as well as issues, comments, merge requests, and so forth, which was interesting to me that you could they were enabling you to move your information outside of their environment, which I think could be great, but it could also be something that if Google tomorrow decides to go buy GitLab, uh, that it would make it easier for people to leave there as opposed to GitHub, which is a
Right.
much more manual process. So
Hmm.
which actually, it's funny. I was having some Twitter conversations specifically about this earlier this week, and so one individual who happened to be a founder of a company that goes through Y Combinator, which I think is also where GitLab came through, was saying that GitLab will probably push to IPO. And then someone else came back and commented that apparently Google was in a bidding war with Microsoft for GitHub. And given the tight integrations between GitLab and Google's cloud environment, I speculated that inside of 6 months, we probably see Google buying GitLab.
Hmm.
Whereas this founder said not going to happen. So I'll be interested to see if it happens. But I, for one, and I think we talked about this when it actually happened last week, Paul, welcome the fact that Microsoft bought GitHub, because Microsoft is not in the business of selling your metadata or any sort of data about you. They're in the business of building things that
Yeah.
you then
No, I agree.
purchase.
Hmm.
So some of the other things as well is, of course, they both have integrations, but in terms of size, this is where it actually, I think, hits that sort of project event horizon. Whereas it was like something like 546,000 projects are on GitLab. In GitHub, there's over 69 million projects.
It's
Uh,
crazy.
yeah, it's interesting to me, but also in this case, GitLab is about 3 years behind the launch of GitHub. So if you think about that early adopter, kind of market share, right? You're grabbing all of that pretty quickly for GitHub, and I think GitHub's only something like, I don't know, $7 for a private account per
Hmm.
month, somewhere between $7 and $10. Don't quote me on that. But GitLab's enterprise starter plan is $39 per user, which to me, I was like, $39? Like I could buy an enterprise plan of one and get a ton of features for a pretty inexpensive price point. So yeah, this article was great. I think if you're seriously considering leaving GitHub, I would caution you to wait, because I imagine the best is yet to come. But if you honestly you're going to go anyway, this might be a worthwhile article for you. That's story number 2 under the "If You Build It" section. Paul, I think we've got time for a few more if you've
Yeah, let's
still got
do
a
it.
few more minutes. So one that I actually wanted to cover was story number 1 under food for thought. It was the ThoughtWorks technology radar. I thought that this was really interesting because It's kind of like, for those that are used to the Gartner quadrants or the Forrester wave, it's similar to those in terms of the way that it talks about products, but it's specific to development. So it talks about languages and frameworks, techniques, platforms, and tools, and gives you some guidance as to whether your development team should adopt it, try it out, or assess it, or hold off. So some of the things that they talk about for like adopt is Kotlin or Assert J, whereas and that's under the technology for languages and frameworks. But if you're looking at the techniques radar, some of the things it says that you should do is lightweight architecture and decision records, whereas trialing things could be polycloud, which I think is like cross-cloud environments from like Google to Azure, or Azure and AWS. But I thought that this was a really cool just kind of guidance. It seems that they come out with this on a regular basis because they're up to version 18, I think. And it just kind of gives you an idea of, perhaps as a security practitioner, where development is going, right? So the closer it is to that middle point, or the bullseye, as it were, the closer you should pay attention to it. So under platforms, it talks about .NET Core and Kubernetes as another example, as well as trialing for Azure or Google Cloud Platform. So did you have a chance to play with this at all, Paul? Were there any things that you picked out of it that you liked?
I did not. Sorry.
That's all good. Don't worry about it. I mean, it was one of those things that as a developer, I was looking at it and I was like, Kubernetes, I've heard both good and bad things about it. And so to that end, I'm always hesitant because I'm a big fan of Docker. But then again, now it's saying that people should adopt it. So maybe I will take a serious look at it. The other one as well, there were two articles under Food for Thought that I thought were good. There's one that's DevOps brings value to security and vice versa. And then DevOps introduces complexity, but then it ultimately goes on to say that that's not really a bad thing. So for the DevOps brings value to security, the one highlight that I took away was a quote from the article that says, "One effective choice is to make sure DevOps engineers are focused on the standardization of the network and application." I thought this was great because to the extent that you can standardize on tooling, you can standardize on test environments, such as something with Docker or Kubernetes. That was the key takeaway of the entire article was, yes, as soon as you have a standard development environment, a standard test environment, and a standard application development process, guess what? Security fits really nicely because you can then start to imprint security practices onto those standards. I don't know if you had a chance to read through any of that article, but
the complexity of getting to a standard, I think, is the issue, right?
Yeah,
because the standard in the industry is always changing. And finding the technology that works for you, and getting to that standard, in my view, is the challenge there. But I agree, once you get there, then you can say, oh, security can be built in this way or that way very easily.
Well, and I think that process is probably becoming easier over time, and especially with the adoption of cloud environments, right? And open source, even better, right? So I always point to, for development teams, if you can standardize on something like VS Code, which has a lot of great features, developed by Microsoft, is open source, and is just incredibly extensible. As a development tool, it's awesome. And then you get things like VS Code Live Share, where you can actually do like code sharing or paired programming as part of that. So working through the process of fixing bugs can be a lot easier. And then from there, if you can then standardize on something like using Jenkins as your kind of universal driver of testing, using Jira as your universal ticketing system, using Docker as your environment development process for production-like environments for testing. It's easier to standardize now than I think it was, 5 or 10 years ago, where you had to order a piece of software, you'd get a bunch of DVDs or CDs, and you'd have to actually install it on a server somewhere in your database, or in your data center. That I think that process has become easier over time. So I hope that it means security will also become easier. But then again, I live in a world of rainbows, unicorns, and cupcakes. So. So I did want to cover just a couple of learning and tools that I threw in here at the end of this story or this news segment, because I thought that would still be useful to our listeners. The first was BitHub Lab. So for all of those companies that are now switching around, where they're hosting their open source project because the great evil Microsoft has bought GitHub, BitHubLab.org allows you to search all three, GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket open source software repositories for the projects that you might be looking for. My word of caution is this. It might have the same name. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the same core developer. And that also doesn't mean that necessarily it's secure, right? So say I name the Node.js project on Bitbucket the same as the one on GitHub.
Right.
Is mine the real one, or is the one on GitHub the real one? So you do have to do a little bit of digging. But I thought it was a cool way to keep track of all of those, projects that are now going somewhere else as a result of that purchase.
Yeah, especially now, for sure.
Yeah. And the other one was Whaletail, which was a cool project written in Go that actually takes a Docker image and reverses it back to a Docker file. So I thought this was cool because, heaven forbid, for some reason, your Docker files get deleted and they're unrecoverable for whatever reason. If you still got the Docker images or the repository of all of your Docker images, you can at least now generate a Docker file from that image to then be stored, shared, moved across your environment accordingly. I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I was kind of wondering what information you could get by running it against other people's Docker images and getting the Docker file.
Yeah, like hard-coded passwords or any sorts of things. I haven't played with it yet to any of the free and open stuff out on Docker Store or Docker Hub. I just might now just to see what happens.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I might even run it against my own because now I'm a little concerned.
Start there. Yep.
Yeah, we will probably be talking about this next week, I am sure. The last thing before we go is I just wanted to point out story number 4 under Food for Thought is our commit strip comic of the week. It's called When You Think You Finished the Project, but Actually You Haven't at all. I think our listeners will enjoy that. But with that, thank you everyone for joining us for another week of Application Security Weekly, and I should say another episode. Remember to get